The story of Glenbrook. In a tranquil glen by a little brook, Captain Prey built himself a house. Why? It's an interesting story. It's a story of fantastic wealth and foolish dreams and fever. Gold fever. The kind of fever that no drink can quell and no doctor can cure. Gold fever transformed the American continent, established the West, and built great cities and a unique culture. Many in this room are here today because of forebears who withstood the epidemic and lived to tell the story to their descendants. The history of Glenbrook begins with a period in United States history when the promise of America had never been so dazzlingly brilliant, lit, as it were, by the glitter of shiny golden nuggets. Gold, it seems, had been discovered in California in 1848, and, within a few years, the epidemic mania of gold fever would sweep the Washoe like a wave rolling from east to west over the country. The country was agog with the reports of the riches being ripped from the golden ground of California, which was shortly to be admitted to the Union as the 31st state. Excited civilians by the tens of thousands were making their way to California with dreams of bubbling stream beds strewn with golden nuggets the size of hens' eggs. Why, even James Polk, the somewhat controversial President of the United States, had declared in his fourth State of the Union address in 1848, "The accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief, were they not corroborated by authentic reports of officers in the public service. The explorations already made warrant the belief that the supply is very large, and that gold is found at various places in an extensive district of country. The effects produced by the discovery of these rich mineral deposits, and the success which has attended the labors of those who have resorted to them, have produced a surprising change in the state of affairs in California. Labor commands a most exorbitant price, and all other pursuits but that of searching for the precious metals are abandoned. Nearly the whole of the male population of the country have gone to the gold districts. Ships arriving on the coast are deserted by their crews, and their voyages suspended for want of sailors." Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune had predicted, "Fortune lies upon the surface of the earth as plentiful as the mud in our streets. We look for an addition within the next 4 years equal to at least $1,000 million to the gold in circulation." Horace wasn't really far off. In the first 5 years of the rush, some 12 million ounces of gold were removed, $8.6 billion at mid-2006 prices. With such reliable sources urging them on, a veritable epidemic of gold lust swept the nation. "California or bust trying" was the motto of those bit by the gold bug, and the bug bit deep. Any means of getting to the gold fields were acceptable, but the trouble was that there were only 3 ways, and none of them were quick. The most convenient was by clipper round the Horn, but the trip could be time-consuming and involved a storm-tossed and violent passage around Cape Horn. A shorter method involved sailing to Panama, a mule ride over the isthmus, and a steamer to the Golden Gateway of California. Unfortunately, this involved malaria, cholera, bandits, and a rather colorful trip through the jungle filled with wild animals, steamy accommodations, and lots of snakes. The third, and by far the more pedestrian way, was by walking on foot all the way across the country. This was quite literally pedestrian. Many an ancestor of those in this room today got here by walking right through the soles of their shoes. Well, there was another way. As this advertisement shows, Rufus Porter, founder of Scientific American, got a bit ahead of himself with this planned method of California travel. R. Porter and Company, 128 Fulton Street, New York, are making active progress in the construction of an aerial transport for the express purpose of carrying passengers between New York and California. This transport will have a capacity to carry from 50 to 100 passengers at a speed of 60 to 100 miles per hour. It is expected to put this machine in operation about the 1st of April, 1849. It is proposed to carry a limited number of passengers, not exceeding 300, for $50, including board, and the transport is expected to make a trip to the gold region and back in 7 days. The price of passage to California is fixed at $200, with the exception above mentioned. Upwards of 200 passenger tickets at $50 each have been engaged prior to February 15th. Books open for subscribers as above. No matter. Undeterred by the danger and hardship, these hardy souls were electrified with the energy created by dreams of the sacks of gold awaiting them at Sutter's Mill. As soon as the ships made dock in San Francisco Bay, the Golden Gate to the western goldfields, they were off with a clatter and a bang, gold pans slung over their shoulder. What they found when they got to the Golden State was a bit of a shock. By 1850, San Francisco had already exploded into a wild, lawless body town of 20,000. Somewhat of a surprise to the eager newcomers who journeyed on to the goldfields near Sacramento, much of the best and most promising territory had already been claimed, argued over, and vigorously defended with shotgun and shell. Food staples were unbelievably expensive. Shortly, many were broke, exhausted, disappointed, and disillusioned. The gold diggings for many were not worth getting killed for. They were ready to try somewheres else. And, as luck and rumor would have it, there were plenty of somewhere elses to try. And try they did. One pleasant May morning in 1850, a wagon train stopped to rest their teams on the banks of the Carson River near the town of Dayton. The train of Mormons were eagerly anticipating reaching the gold fields in California, and in their eagerness had departed Salt Lake a bit too early. Winter had been hard that year in the Sierra, and snow still glistened off the lofty peaks. The short break on the trail left young William Bruce with some time on his hands, and, wishing to get in a bit of practice with his gold pan, young William decided to try it out in the nearby stream. After a while, much to his surprise, he did find a few colors in the bottom of the pan, but truthfully it wasn't much. The entire party agreed that much greater claims awaited just over the Sierra, so the discovery was not thought to be very important, and soon the party moved on. But within a few days it seemed that the reports of deep snow remaining in the Sierra passes were no exaggeration, so the wagon train stopped once again to await a further thaw. Two prospectors, John Orr and Nick Kelly, returned to that promising spot found a few days earlier, and spent 2 weeks prospecting along the western stream. What they found was equally unimpressive. This most assuredly was not the spot they wanted, and although Orr did dig out a small nugget from a niche, the area was given up as a loss. As a joke, Orr gave the canyon the high-sounding title of Gold Canyon. Actually, it wasn't a canyon at all, and, as it would prove out, had very little gold. But what it did have would change the shape of the Sierra Timber Range for nearly a century. Gold Canyon was like many other bramble-tangled gulches throughout the Washoe, filled with dry sage, crumbly rock, and the only dust it lacked was gold dust. The discovery of that little nugget from the much misnamed Gold Canyon soon became greatly exaggerated, and a number of recently disenfranchised but expectant gold millionaires came to the dusty Washoe to try their luck. From 1852 to 1855, about 100 men worked there part of each year. Most were disappointed. In January of 1859, James Finney, also known as Old Virginie, persuaded two others, Peter O'Reilly and Patrick McLaughlin, to share in a likely prospect along Gold Canyon. On one of his hunting trips, Old Virginie had discovered a promising-looking area of yellow dirt. In January 28, 1859, the men began to prospect, even though there was snow on the ground. They cleared some of the snow off and washed a few pans of dirt that they found at the mouth of a ground squirrel's burrow. It seemed promising. A few days after the discovery, Lemuel S. Sandy Bowers, Joseph Plato, Henry Comstock, James Rogers, and William Knight looked the area over and placed a claim on an adjoining 50-foot strip, which they later subdivided, each taking a 10-foot strip across the hill and the gulch. The gold was good and getting better. Soon they were mining as much as $20 a day. This in a day when the editor of the Territorial Enterprise, the local newspaper, only made $25 a week. It wasn't long before their gold pans were abandoned, and more elaborate sluice boxes were constructed to flush water over the ore in greater amounts. In their eagerness to find richer and richer ground, they dug deeper and deeper, and the sluice boxes began to turn up heavy bluish-gray quartz. None of the miners had ever seen anything like it before. This blue stuff sure wasn't gold, and there was a large amount throughout the hills and easily available. But we must remember that these were gold miners, and it never occurred to them that the blue stuff had any value at all. Finally, on June 27th, some of that blue stuff was taken along with more promising gold ore to the assay office in Grass Valley, California. To no one's surprise, it wasn't gold. But it was valuable. That blue stuff turned out to be a nearly pure alloy of sulphuret of silver, a mixture of gold and silver ore. The first sample was a good one, worth $840 a ton. But the next sample was worth an astonishing $3,876 to the ton, 3/4 silver and 1/4 gold. That did it. The first Washoe rush was on. The Comstock Lode, named after the claim made by Henry Comstock, was born, and within the year, disillusioned gold miners who had lost all they had were packing up their burros for the trip east back over the Sierra to the claims around Mount Davidson, the fabulous mountain of silver and gold that they had been dreaming about all along. Just how big was the Comstock? Well, comparisons of wealth and value are difficult to comprehend today. In these days, we have income taxes and minimum wages and a variety of other taxes on our purse. But during the heyday of the Comstock, none of these things existed. The money the Comstock plutocrats made, to a large extent, they kept. So how much money did the fabulous mountain disgorge? I've charted the approximate output of the fields and converted them to $2,005. Notice that the time scale is not contiguous. Virginia City had the rather bad habit of burning to the ground on a regular basis, and as you might imagine, that had a negative effect on both the population and the mining operations. So, in condensed form, here's an idea of the kind of wealth these nabobs were notching up. Notice that the graph shows two precious metals pouring out of the mine simultaneously, both gold and silver. Methods and means varied over the years, and the crude techniques of the early years no doubt left lots of rich ore behind. But even taking that into account, it is clear that by the early 1860s, Virginia City was producing $60 to $70 million worth of gold and silver each year in today's dollars, and more was being discovered every day. Ultimately, it would reach the incredible annual production of nearly $600 million by its peak year of 1877. Notice at the bottom of the graph I've estimated the combined total, though it's probably only a guess. It's enough to give you an idea, however, of the reason for all the hysteria. The Comstock produced about $6 billion worth of wealth in a 20-year period. This, when a common laborer was often paid wages of less than $1 a day. $1 went a lot longer in those days. Not that it came easy. Mining in the Comstock was anything but that. The field around the newly named town of Virginia City, named after Old Virginia, presented some unique problems. The ground was soft and the mines ran deep. Soon the frequent cave-ins, caused by the frantic shoveling of the inexperienced miners, required constant reinforcement. Within 2 years, the easy ore had been stripped off the surface, and it was clear that while the ore was there and very rich, it was going to require more than sweat and a shovel to get at the real treasure. Steam power was going to be needed for this job, and sharp-eyed capitalists with plenty of cash began looking the area over. Considering the bonanza of wealth that was erupting from the mountain, no expense would be spared to dig as fast and as deep as possible. Soon, huge steam-driven winches, hoists, and cranes were arriving by ox-cart in pieces to be assembled in the swiftly deepening caverns. The best engineers in the world were given the job of solving the problem of the soft earth and dangerous cave-ins. Shortly, the problem was solved by a unique way of shoring the mines. A German engineer, Philipp Dietersheimer, solved the problem by prefabricating cubes of timbers that became stronger when filled with crushed rock. Since crushed rock was in no short supply, the system worked wonderfully well. From that point on, production from the Comstock would steadily climb. But steam power required fuel, and soon the forests around Carson and Dayton were stripped clear. The weather on top of Mount Davidson was quite severe in winter. To shore up the mines, feed the machines, and to provide heating for year-round mining required lumber in large quantities. Dayton and the surrounding area had little in the way of trees, so by 1860, timber was in itself a form of green gold. In March 1860, the Sacramento Union wrote, "The price of lumber at Virginia City was $100 per 1,000 board feet. A month later, the price had advanced to $300 per 1,000. Clearly there was money to be made in timber, but where to find it? It didn't take long to find the solution. About 30 miles distant to the west, high in the Sierra, was a glittering mountain lake surrounded by more timber than a man could imagine. The forests of Lake Tahoe would feed the hungry maw of the Comstock. Entrepreneurs like Michael Spooner and his French-Canadian partners cast an avaricious eye on the immense virgin forest of the Lake Tahoe basin. Here was more green gold than could ever be cut. And, at $300 a 1,000 foot, a vast fortune was to be had for the swing of an axe handle. Spooner set up a sawmill and bought holdings north of the present-day junction of U.S. Highway 50 and State Highway 28. Within a short time, Spooner's station had a regular and lucrative trade, carrying cut timber down the Kings Canyon Causeway to Carson City and the Washoe. For the first time, the Tahoe Basin echoed with the crack of the axe and the splintering of the ancient pines which had surveyed the lovely and majestic lake for thousands of years. Tahoe would never be quite the same. Around 1861, Captain Augustus W. Prey, C.R. Barrett, and N.D. Winters purchased 1,000 acres of property in the tranquil glen on the western slope of the Carson Range of the Sierra and set up a logging operation in Glenbrook Valley. by building a sawmill on the banks of Lake Bigler, soon to be called Lake Tahoe, near Yellow Jacket Road. Augustus Pray came from New England to California in 1853, and he had been a sea captain, familiar with both the Atlantic and Pacific waters. He reportedly ran a vessel along the Pacific coast during the 1850s as far north as Puget Sound. In 1860, he came to the Tahoe Basin with his two partners to build that sawmill of 1863. Being good at commanding seamen, it's no wonder that shortly Pray had a smoothly operating operation. And it was quite an operation. In its first year of production, the Lake Bigler Lumber Company's mill employed 12 men, and by using the water power from Glenbrook Creek, about 3/4 mile away, turned out 20,000 foot of lumber in 24 hours. At $300 a thousand foot, LBLC was making a princely $6,000 a day. Green gold, indeed, even by today's standards. Meanwhile, in Virginia City, the mines of the Comstock roared on. As the demand grew, so did the costs. Soon, Pray bought out his partners, acquired more land, and, in 1864, installed steam boilers to power the saws. A close examination of the photo will show you the smoke coming from those steam boilers as the sawmills turn. In ever-increasing number, the patiently plodding oxen began their regular journey up and down the Washoe, and Captain Pray built his house near the bubbling brook on South Meadow and settled back to enjoy his newly minted status of green gold millionaire. The idea had occurred to others. In 1861, Sam Clements, the younger brother of Orion Clements, secretary to James Nye, newly appointed governor of the new territory of Nevada, bored with his duties at being the secretary to the secretary, decided to see the fabled lake in the sky and traveled by foot up the Sierra to the Glenbrook Valley. In his famous book Roughing It, young Sam, under his pen name Mark Twain, wrote, 3 miles away was a sawmill and some workmen, but there were not 15 other human beings throughout the wide circumference of the lake. As the darkness closed down and the stars came out and spangled the great mirror with jewels, we smoked meditatively in the solemn hush and forgot our troubles and pains. But Sam was more interested in drifting over the lake and building castles in the sky than hacking them out of the forest, and soon the project was abandoned. Sam's fame would rest elsewhere. But for some, the opportunity was as alluring as the El Dorado. In 1863, the Lake Bigler Toll Road was completed, which provided a faster way to the Comstock over Spooner Summit, and traffic increased exponentially. With the opening of the new road, another need arose to service the moneyed travelers who plied the Bonanza Road back and forth from Sacramento and San Francisco and the mountain of silver and gold that was the Comstock. One of Pray's partners, Joseph Winters, had sold out his share previously to Captain Pray, and now he decided it was time to invest in the hotel business. He threw in with Lou Colbath of Virginia City and purchased 45 acres from Pray, about a half-mile from the lake. In 1864, he built a comfortable 2.5-story inn, cozily nestled in a crook in the toll road as it ran toward the sawmills on the banks of the lake. Not being hotel men themselves, they leased it to an experienced hotel keeper, A.S. Beatty, and called the lovely spot Glenbrook House. Soon it became known as one of the finest inns on the Pacific coast. Glenbrook House was located at the junction of Old Highway 50 and our present-day Pray Meadow Road, along the Lake Bigler Toll Road. This surveyor's map shows the location and significantly shows the road continuing down to the sawmills on the banks of the then Lake Bigler. Standing at that location today, you can see the tall timbers that surround the former location of the inn. Those trees are first-growth timber, since there wasn't any reason to cut down the trees that shaded the inn, and considering all the plentiful lumber that surrounded the place. We could stop our story here, for we have answered the question of why Prey built his little home near the present rodeo grounds. Fortunately for us, however, Bill Bliss has retained the registry from all the hotels that were built in Glenbrook, and that of the Glenbrook House is among them. That register reveals much about the times and the promise of our lovely Glen by the bubbling brook. It is a history revealed in the pages of this book by the signatures it contains. So for a few more moments, let's return to late in 1864 and peer through the lens of fading memory at our own early history. Notice on this page how the names at the top have changed from Winters and Colbath to A.S. Beatty. The new manager took hold right away, placing his name and that of his wife and sons at the top, with home as their place of residence. Also notice an interesting entry of R.M. Haslam, Pony Bob Haslam. Pony Bob was one of the most daring and best-known Pony Express riders on the route. In March of 1861, he was assigned the round-trip run from Friday Station, near present-day Harrah's Casino, to Buckland Station near Fort Churchill, about 75 miles away. Fort Churchill was the eastern end of the telegraph line, so any news from the east was carried by riders from Buckland to Sacramento. Pony Bob's greatest ride was 120 miles in an astonishing 8 hours and 20 minutes, and he did it while wounded. This was the fastest trip ever made by the Pony Express in toto. Why was the Pony Express so eager to get the news from the east? War between the North and South seemed certain, and California was poised to secede from the Union. The reason for the urgency, therefore, was that Pony Bob, along with the other riders, carried Lincoln's inaugural address, and the mild attitude of the new president helped keep California in the Union. Pony Bob is also credited with the longest round-trip ride. On about May 10th, he received the San Francisco mail, as usual, at Friday Station. But at Buckland Station, his relief rider was so badly frightened over the Indian threat that he refused to take the mail. Haslam agreed to take the mail all the way to Smith's Creek for a total distance of 190 miles without a rest. 9 hours later, he retraced his route with the westbound mail, but at Cold Springs found that Indians had raided the place, killed the station keeper, and run off all the stock. Pony Bob reached Buckland Station after making a 380-mile round trip. Early in the registry is the entry of Irwin McDowell, Major General, United States Army, and his accompanying staff. McDowell had been in command at the First Battle of Bull Run, which you'll remember was a complete Union disaster. The First Battle of Bull Run was considered the best planned and most poorly executed battle of the Civil War. Fortunately for McDowell, he was not held responsible for the Union defeat, and instead given command of the Union troops south of the Potomac. The fact that he was given such a prominent post is an indication of the esteem in which he was held. The date would seem to suggest that McDowell was on his way to the Presidio in San Francisco to take over as commander of the Army of the Pacific Coast. Here is a signature of interest that appears in November of 1864. It belongs to William Stewart, first senator of the state. What catches the eye is the date, November 27, 1864. What's so interesting about that date? Well, Nevada officially became the 36th state on October 31st, 1864, not quite a month earlier. Stewart is remembered for establishing the Stewart Indian School on a local reservation near Carson City, which endeavored to train the local Washoe Indian children in skills that would allow them to enter white society and make their way. It is difficult for us now to imagine the complexity of the problem of integrating the native peoples of America into the United States of the 1860s. They were nearly completely incompatible. By teaching the children English and a trade, it was hoped to ease the difficult transition of melding one culture into another. Among the many signatures are a few of more than passing interest. By 1867, Glenbrook House had become a comfortable meeting place for politicians and financiers, as well as a famous inn. Here we find a meeting of Schuyler Colfax, then Speaker of the House of Representatives, along with other members of Congress. D.E. Avery's signature is notable as well. He was the congressman from Nevada. They're meeting with several Virginia city worthies. The question is why? This meeting is taking place just prior to the 1868 election, when Schuyler Colfax would be elected Vice President of the United States on the same ticket with Ulysses S. Grant as President. Now, could it be that Schuyler was lining up some support from the resident plutocrats of the richest city west of Wall Street? Here's William Tecumseh Sherman on his way to the Presidio. It was Sherman who began a scorched earth policy of reducing the buffalo herds to starve the Indians into retreating to a reservation. While inhumane by our standards today, it's easy to forget that the Indians were at war with the United States, and as is customary, the loser of a war loses their property. In this case, it was a lot of property, and in Sherman's case, his job was to win it, which in characteristic fashion he did. Not all the guests of the Glenbrook House were politicians, warriors, or statesmen, and most were certainly not able to sign their own name. So we find a number of entries in a familiar feminine hand, most likely the mistress of the inn. What is of interest are her comments revealing the condition of some of her guests. Before we come to the end of our tale, we should acknowledge the influence of A.W. Pray on the little town of Glenbrook, because indeed he was the father of the town. In 1864, Pray built and launched the Governor Blaisdell, a 42-foot side-wheel ferry boat which operated for 12 years, carrying thousands of passengers and towing rafts of logs to his mills. He also began building cottages in the meadow, and in 1876 built a hotel called the Lake Shore House. The Lake Shore House was equipped with a large dancing hall, boats for fishing, and, for those who wish to drive the splendid mountain roads, spirited teams and handsome and comfortable vehicles for mountaineering excursions. There were billiard tables, an ice cream parlor for the ladies, and a fine stock of cigars and California fruits when in season. By the mid-1870s, Captain Pray had built 30 cottages, a sawmill, a hotel, a store, a saloon, a livery stable, and a meat market. Glenbrook was becoming a real town. But things were about to change rather abruptly, and that story is revealed in the pages of the Glenbrook House registration book. So, to conclude this narrative, let us return to the last few pages of interest of a remarkable meeting held in Glenbrook House in 1871. This is the signature of Leland Stanford and wife, which is especially noteworthy because of his prominence as president of the Central Pacific Railroad, which was the western branch of the Transcontinental Railroad. Somewhat later, we find another member of the Big Four, Charles Crocker and wife, staying at the fine hostelry. Clearly, little Glenbrook House was building a fine reputation along the West Coast. But then you may notice a somewhat puzzling entry beneath Crocker's name, that of what appears to be John W. Vanderbilt. This is not the famous Cornelius Vanderbilt of New York Central fame, but is it a relative? Odd that Crocker, representing the Central Pacific, and Vanderbilt should be rooming together in June of 1871, isn't it? But the puzzle becomes odder still when we notice entries on June 18th and June 19th of the same year. Here we find an odd coincidence of a curious meeting of some of the wealthiest and most influential men in the United States. C.H. Vanderbilt is Commodore Vanderbilt of New York Central fame. W.H. Seward is the former Secretary of State under both Lincoln and Johnson. As Secretary of State, Seward had great influence and connection, and was involved in granting the right-of-way for the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. William Sharon is the Nevada agent for the Bank of California. We are, of course, familiar with D.L. Bliss, but what is interesting is what we find on the following day. On the following day, W.C. Ralston's name appears in the registry. Ralston is the president of the Bank of California, the second richest bank in the United States at the time. So what were these men up to? A meeting was obviously being held for a particular purpose. The answer may reveal itself in an event that occurred about a month later of the same year, when D.L. Bliss and Darius Ogden Mills meet once again at Glenbrook. D.O. Mills was also a founder of the Bank of California and a founder of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. Could it be a coincidence that this is the year when some stupendous purchases of land and property are about to take place? D.L. Bliss, armed with what must have been a mountain of cash, begins to buy out all the lumbering operations in the Tahoe Basin. He purchases all of Glenbrook, including Pray's entire operation, and several smaller operators as well, and then proceeds to purchase huge tracts of lumber. This forms the basis for the Carson Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company, which ultimately owned 50,000 acres of timberland on the shores of Lake Tahoe. By 1873, they had acquired all of Michael Spooner's ranch, the Summit Fluming Company, and all of Pray's holdings. One of the CTL&F's greatest assets was the Summit V Flume, which they acquired when they bought out the Summit Fluming Company's operations. That allowed timber and cordwood to float down the Clear Creek Flume to Carson. The last piece of the puzzle was the construction of a narrow-gauge railroad to haul logs to Spooner Summit. In 1875, Yarrington and Bliss completed construction of the Glenbrook Railroad at the stupendous cost of construction of $30,000 per mile, and the railroad was 8.5 miles long, over $250,000. In addition, the railroad had 45 cars and 2 engines, which were purchased upon the track's completion. Costs to operate and maintain the railroad were stupendous as well, averaging $3,000 a month. And so almost overnight, the tranquil little glen near the bubbling brook became the centerpiece of a railroad logging empire that provided most of the timber to fuel the growth of the Comstock. But that is a story for another day. The industrial Glenbrook of 1873 would last only about 25 years. With the decline of the Comstock, Glenbrook would change again and revert back into the place that we all know and cherish today. Much of the material in this narrative comes only through the kindness and cooperation of Bill Bliss, whose family held Glenbrook in their personal care from 1871 onwards. Because of that care and kindness, Glenbrook remains today the tranquil and beautiful place it is. It would have been very tempting over the years for the Bliss family to have sold off much of their land and developed it, and we would, instead of living in Glenbrook, be living in something like Crystal Bay or Kings Beach or Incline Village. That trail of governance was handed down from Dwayne and Elizabeth Bliss to their 4 boys and 1 daughter, Hope, who is not in this particular picture, and thence to William S. Bliss, Bill's grandfather, Will M. Bliss, Bill's father, and then to Bill. Here's an early picture of Bill and the next generation of Bliss's, Billy. We know them both well, since they are our neighbors and friends, and it is entirely due to their concern for this little part of Lake Tahoe that we lucky few have such a pleasant place to dwell.